Okay, I was very gratified to know. Don't go yet. Gratified to know that so many of you have already seen the exhibit upstairs, the Radical Camera exhibit, because what I'm going to talk about tonight, that exhibit provides a lot of very significant context for what I'm going to have to say about Weegee, because there are a lot of similarities between what he was doing and other photographers in the Photo League were doing, but more importantly, there were very, very significant differences in their styles. And mostly this evening I'm going to talk about those differences. You may proceed. This man that you are about to see on the screen is without question the greatest and most influential tabloid news photographer in history. What really sets him apart from the other people whose work you saw in that exhibit is that Weegee is born where commerce and art collide. Because most of the photographers who were in the Photo League in New York were in it because they wanted to be artists. And although Weegee very much had an artistic sensibility, he was in it to make money. He was in it because he was a news hound. That was in his blood. And as we get deeper into this conversation, I will explain to you exactly why that is. But as you can see, this is Weegee's own self-image. The genius of the camera, it says at the bottom of this. A completely self-taught photographer, street kid, New York street kid, who grew up literally amongst the people that would become his greatest subject. The other thing that really distinguishes him from everyone else that you see in that exhibit upstairs is that he completely owned the night. There are barely any photographs in that exhibit upstairs of New York after dark, and that is where Weegee worked his magic. This is a photograph that he took in the late 1930s that is sort of emblematic of the work that he did at the beginning of his career. It's called, he titled it, One Way Ride. And this, nobody's going to mistake this for an art photograph. But this is what Weegee was paid to go out and get. And his ability to tell a story in these incredible flash pops from his speed graphic camera is what really set him apart. The genius, of course, here is that he manages to capture this man's death and this baby carriage in the background so that you have the corpse and the baby carriage in the same image. His thing was all about getting the story in one single, incredibly bold image. So the amazing thing to realize about this man is that he came to the United States when he was 11 years old, and he did not really begin his career as a freelance news photographer until he was 36 years old. Everything up till then was an apprenticeship, learning about cameras in the dark room and basically scraping out a living in various ways. All through his adolescence, he played the violin. That was his first love, but there was no way to make a living playing the violin. He was the original model for Clifford Odets's Golden Boy, with the violin. But he ended up turning to this. And nobody else would stake out this terrain, whether they didn't have the feel for it, whether they didn't have the guts to go out in the middle of the night in Manhattan on the Lower East Side and actually look for trouble happening. This became his stock and trade. He was the first person to really pursue this. He would sell these photographs on a freelance basis to the Acme newspaper service. They would pay maybe $20 for one murder. And after 2 years of freelancing like that, he became the first citizen in the United States to be allowed to have a police radio in his car. And that allowed him to get to the scene of crimes incredibly fast. This is almost this image is synonymous in many ways with Weegee. But this is entitled so brilliantly and poetically, Corpse with Revolver. This is, to me, this is like a classic shot because it captures so much the indifference of death in the big city. Notice the cop walking away. He waited to take this picture until the cop was just walking away with his hands behind his back. The corpse is covered up, and always with Weegee there is the telling detail. In this case, it would be the fact that it's a woman, because you can see her purse lying there right next to the sheet. So probably this was the victim of a car accident. And one thing that you always have to look at in Weegee photographs that's really telling is how fast he got to the scene, because the corpse will either be covered or not covered by the time he takes the picture. In many cases, he would decide what was the more effective photograph, seeing the corpse exposed or actually kind of the anonymity. And in this case, I actually think that he preferred this image because the purse was the telling detail that gave identity to the victim in this photo, where you didn't actually see the gender of the person. This is typical of a Weegee shot. I wish this was a little bigger. It's called Murder on the Roof. And one of the things that separated Weegee from other photographers who plied this beat was that he was obsessed with the act of murder as a social phenomenon, where other photographers would show up at the scene and try to get a picture of the victim. Weegee understood that much of the drama was in the totality of the scene, and he always tried to get the people gawking and watching from across the way. And this is such an incredibly intense New York image with the people on the tenement roof across the way watching. And sometimes, as you'll see in other photos as we go through, there's almost a party atmosphere in some cases. This is one of his most iconic photographs. This is one where he got to the scene right on time. Hence, there are a lot of theories about how Weegee got his name. When he was working as an apprentice in the photo department of the New York Times, his job was wiping away the excess water on the newsprints, and he was called the Squeegee Boy, and he became just nicknamed Squeegee. And then he, of course, being the greatest single self-promoter in the newspaper game, transferred that and transmogrified that into Weegee, and claimed that it was based on the Ouija board, the popular Ouija board, because he could divine magically where the crimes were going to happen before they actually happened. So he took the name Weegee. Now, the very, very practical aspect to all of this is that he was also hiding his ethnicity. Because if you worked in the newspaper business back then, you did not want to have a particularly ethnic name. It was far, this may come as a surprise to some of you, but Eddie Muller is not my real family name. My father, who was a newspaper man, worked at the San Francisco Examiner from the 1930s on. Actual family name is Vojkovic. And when he got his job and his first byline, first thing the sports editor said was, you got to change your name because nobody named Vojkovic gets a byline in this newspaper. So if Yusher Felig was going to become the greatest crime photographer in history, he needed a different name. And so that's why he chose Weegee. This is Weegee at work. That body is still red hot on the asphalt here. This photograph is called Gunman Killed by Off-Duty Cop, 344 Broome Street, February 3rd, 1942. That is a crime photograph. This photograph is so amazing. If you can see what's actually happening, one of the great mysteries of this image is what has actually happened. The gunman has fallen face first on the ground with his cigar still in his mouth. And that's what he's obviously bleeding, but that's a cigar that is still wedged in his mouth on the ground. That is an absolutely classic photograph. Now, this, I think, is a very significant moment in Weegee's his development. It's a picture he took of a murder scene called On the Spot. The very effective New York Police Department standing around with nothing to do after the murder has taken place. This is Weegee's photograph of the scene. But this is a photograph by another anonymous photographer who captured Weegee at the scene. And I really think that when he saw this photograph, it kind of changed his approach to what he was doing. Number one, you'll see in Weegee's photograph, the body is covered. In this photograph, the body is actually exposed. But the crucial thing, and I love this image because it shows the crime photographer at work, something you rarely get to see in these images. But note the sign on the lamppost behind Weegee. It says, "The law." It just says, "The law. Keep your sidewalk clean. Never sweep refuse into street." Well, how perfect is that, right? And once Weegee sees this, he starts to incorporate this kind of humor into his photographs. And you get beautiful things like this. This is Weegee showing up at the scene as they're trying to cover the body. What he's getting in this shot is really only the feet of the victim, but it's in front of a movie theater that, of course, is showing Irene Dunne in Joy of Living on the marquee. So this kind of very ironic, pithy, dead of night humor is what would become Weegee's stock in trade. This is the man himself on the prowl in Manhattan. He had a 38 Chevy that was outfitted, like I say. This is before it was outfitted with the police radio. But as you can see, he was a character, what can you say, right out of the movies that hadn't actually been made yet. This is Weegee's in the trunk of his 38 Chevy, where he had a complete office on wheels. The legend has it that he developed photographs in the trunk of the car. That's totally apocryphal. It's not true at all. He would go back to his apartment and do the work there, but he had everything he needed to bribe people. Note in the bottom right here, you can see this box in the bottom right corner on that little platform where he's typing is one of his huge boxes of cigars that he would use to just bribe cops and everybody as he went through the night. That was like a big... That was a big deal. He had multiple cameras back there. He had the typewriter so that he could type up all the information about the crimes that he was seeing. Or earlier on, before he had the police radio, he would just run back to the police station because his apartment was directly across the street from the police station. His studio apartment was at 5 Park Center Market in Lower Manhattan, and he had an apartment right above a gun shop that was directly across from the police station, and he would start the night going in there to see what was hot on the wire, and then he would run back, get the information about the crime that he had just photographed, run up to his darkroom, process the picture, develop it, and get it to the news syndicate by like 5 o'clock in the morning, and they would get it into the papers for the Bulldog editions or something in the morning. This is his studio apartment. I'm going to say this was early 1940s. He lived there alone because he is using a time exposure. That's what he's doing with his hand there. You can see the cord on the cot. He's taking this photograph of himself. He has a lot of his work up on the wall around him. There's also another police radio in the apartment with him. Well, I'll get to that later. This is the outside. And this is Weegee on the ledge up there outside his apartment directly across from police headquarters. He's obviously getting a good angle on the paddy wagon coming in, bringing some guys into the precinct there. This building is still in New York. You can go there. Now, this is an image that was taken for a photo essay on Weegee when he started to get his reputation. And this is, again, his self-image that he was creating this character right out of the movies. You can see this is a girl that he knew who was an assistant or something, and it's like he's getting the hot tip, right? Well, the newspaper that she has in her hands, that's PM. That is the publication, very, very progressive newspaper, tabloid newspaper in New York that was essential to Weegee's development, both as a crime photographer and as an artist. It was a really, really amazing publication, and they gave him essentially carte blanche. Once he really showed that he knew what he was doing and that he had access that nobody else had, and he had these divine powers, the editor at PM basically just said, go out there, do it, bring the pictures back, we'll print them. And it was that leeway that ended up allowing him to develop this immense body of work that would at some point turn into his huge success. Again, is this man living his own film noir movie or what? I mean, this was another photograph in that series of him starting out the night, heading out into New York on the prowl. And might I say that, you know, these pictures are taken in the late 1930s, right? No such thing as film noir actually existed yet in public consciousness. I mean, not even the movies that Hollywood would make had really come to fruition yet. So his view of New York, as you can see, and his view of himself in that milieu is going to be very, very influential. Here he has himself photographed, as it says at the bottom, my studio, a patrol wagon. And this is exactly the kind of picture that he specialized in when, you know, he was known as the photographer of Murder Incorporated. When the gangsters held sway in New York and there were all kinds of gang wars and the mob was really taking over, Weegee was the photographer of choice. If you were getting called in and braced by the law for something and you were going to get your picture taken, you wanted Weegee to take the picture. Of course, they often covered their faces. As you can see, always the telling detail with Weegee. What I love about this picture is if you look closely, you can see those guys are wearing tuxedos because you can see the satin stripe on the pants. These were high society guys who got a little drunk and started behaving a little recklessly. And as you'll see as we go further into this program, Weegee had a particular eye out for the upper class. When he could catch them with their pants down, so to speak, he would really dive right in there and try to get the best possible photograph he could. But a lot of these images are very, very much, this is Weegee's New York. And again, no one is going to claim that this is a great art photograph, but he was completely unafraid of doing things with the camera. As we'll talk about, he would prefer to have the askew composition, his flash bouncing off the light hat of this guy in front of him. He wasn't afraid of other photographers jumping into his picture because to him it just added to the action and the vitality of the image. He always felt that he was going to get the best shot. No matter what, he was going to be the one to end up with the best shot. This is a beautiful, this is an actual beautiful photograph called Anthony Esposito, Accused Cop Killer. Do you think the NYPD roughed him up a little bit when he was in custody? I think so. Now, here is a great photograph. You all get it. It's pretty obvious what this is. Weegee titled the photograph, "The Gay Deceiver." What I love about this picture, I don't know if you can see it so clearly up on the screen here, all eyes riveted on this transvestite getting out of the paddy wagon. It's the guys still in the paddy wagon that make this photo so great. They are so completely mortified of being seen with this guy that you can just see right back here, there's this guy, he's actually praying like this. Like, oh, please, no. And the guy over here on the left is kind of, he realizes there's a photographer and he's starting to cover his face. It's just, and of course, the star of the show couldn't be happier to be photographed. And it's a good shot. You look great, you know. This is Weegee at the scene of an accident. You cannot take a better news photograph than that. That succeeds on every level. This is an ambulance that actually runs off a bridge and crashes into the canal. And there is no way that you can get a better photo than that. And it's weird. It seems odd to talk about this and to talk about the brilliance of his compositions and the incredible sense he had for the moment to take the picture, and to talk about it as art when in fact that man is dead that they're pulling out of the water there. But to Weegee, he ran up against a lot of opposition when people said, but it's not art because it's so lurid. It was just not really the thing that a polite person did for a living. It meant absolutely nothing to him. He said the greatest subject in the world is life and death. And if I can photograph that moment, that's it. That's all he wanted to do, was get that exact moment. You'll hear a little more about this photograph in a short while. I'm not going to tell you what it's called. I'm going to leave that to somebody else. But again, this is an example of how there's a murder. This poor guy here is dead in the doorway of a candy store. But rather than run up and take the picture of the dead guy, he chose to photograph the entirety of the building for this image. We'll have more to say about that shortly. Okay, here's another example of when people say he's taking these grotesque, lurid images. This is a photograph of a car accident. These two kids hijacked a car and took it for a joyride and then crashed it on Fifth Avenue. And this is the picture that Weegee got from this incident. This is the two kids in the car waiting for the ambulance to arrive. And it's just a fabulous photograph. He goes after big emotions, but you're never exactly sure what the emotions are. And there's never just one in the picture. That's what's so amazing, because this is shocking when you first glance at it. You know something terrible has happened. Then you look again, and there's this incredible tenderness with these two young boys, and the guy is actually like putting a cigarette in the mouth of his friend as they wait for the ambulance to arrive. Now, what photographer would have waited and something good is going to happen here, and I'm going to get that? And it's really a perfect photograph. Okay, this is Weegee at his most humorous, where he responds to a fire call, and he goes to the building, and of course, when he looks up and sees high-grade all-beef frankfurters on the top of the building, and at the mid-range it says, "Simply add boiling water," he figures, okay, thank you, I now have my shot. But if you think that he was immune to the emotion in these incidents, then he would take a photograph like this. And this is one of his most famous photos, and he entitled this, "I Cried When I Took This Picture." Mrs. Henrietta Torres and her daughter Ada watch another daughter and her son die in the fire. That's the name of this photograph, that entire title. He always said that when you establish a bond with your subject so that when they are laughing and they are crying, you are as well, paraphrasing, then you know that you're on the right track. And one of the things that's really essential about Weegee's work is that he came from this. He is not an interloper coming and taking pictures like of the big city like a zoo. This is where he came from. And he knows all of these people, and he felt that he was entitled to get this close. And that's a very, very important part of his work. Now, this photo, I included this in here. This is a little weird because this purported to be an image of his show at the Photo League in the early 1940s, but I actually don't believe it is because the clothes on these people look too much like a 1960s style to be the early 40s. I think what this is a recreation of his show at the Photo League. And the reason I included this was because one of the things that I really appreciate about Weegee is he was an artist and he understood art, but he had absolutely no pretensions about being an artist. And when he had the show, he put these images up on the wall just like with staples and tacks, and he hand wrote the captions, like you saw the like this at the bottom. It says, "Simply add boiling water." That's him scrawling on the photograph. It's very, very important to understand Weegee's art and influence. Going ahead. To understand that he was one of the first, quote-unquote, artists engaged in completely reproducible mass art, right? I mean, he wasn't making these photographs to put on a museum wall. They were running in the newspaper. He would give photographs to people. It didn't matter to him really what the dimensions were of the image. If you've seen images up here on the screen tonight with the crop marks on it, he was so used to this from the newspapers saying, well, this is the part of the photograph that we want to use, we'll lose that part, that he had no artistic pretension about, oh, but this is part of the image as well. When you look at Weegee's photographs in different books, they're all different. The same photograph may appear as a vertical in one book and a horizontal image in another book. And it actually didn't matter to him because he really felt that it was the story in the photograph. Like, I got that moment, and it didn't matter how it was presented or that it was, he just didn't have that artistic attitude about him. This is the book that made him. When he had a lot of these photographs put together, he produced this hardcover book called Naked City. And nobody had seen anything quite like this before. I love the inscription, "To Dale Smith, from one genius to another." Notice the lack of the H in another. From one genius to another. This book would change everything. And you can see right here this is his little photo credit that he stamped on the back of all of his photographs when it went to the news syndicate. Credit photo by Weegee the Famous. Okay, now, let me see what we got here. Oh, okay. If you can douse this for a second. Danny, if you can darken the screen for a second. I think I'm feeling it tonight with Weege tonight. Okay, it's gone. Thank you. I think what we can actually do here tonight, since he was an amazing guy, he knows this show is going on about the Photo League. I think he wants to be here. And I'm starting to feel that his presence is strongly felt. So I think what we should do is actually interview the man himself. Are you all, I mean, it's going to take like a little spiritual connection here to raise him tonight, but I think we can actually do it. So rather than hear me continue to go on about Mr. Fellig's work, I think we should ask him himself. So if he was here, I would say, how do you actually go about deciding what it is you want to photograph? Because after all, there are 8 million stories in the Naked City. How do you know what kind of story to follow?
What I did simply was this. I went down to Manhattan Police Headquarters. For 2 years, I worked without a police car or any kind of credentials. When a story came over the police teletype, I would go to it. And the idea was I sold the pictures to the newspapers. And naturally, I picked a story that meant something. In other words, names make news. If there's a fight between a drunken couple on 3rd Avenue or 9th Avenue in Hell's Kitchen, nobody cares. It's just a barroom brawl. But if society has a fight, and the Cadillac on Park Avenue, and their names, they're in the social register, this makes news, and the papers are interested in that.
Okay. But how do you do it if it's a society person that has been arrested and they don't want to have their picture taken? How do you get that photograph?
When a person gets in trouble and they get arrested, the first thing they do, they cover up their faces. And editors don't like it. They say, don't give me any excuses. Give me a picture so our readers can see what the person looks like. For example, A woman, the New York cops arrested a woman who was wanted for a $25,000 jewel robbery in Washington, D.C. The woman, being a dope, was naturally captured. She was in a cell downstairs in the basement of Manhattan Police Headquarters. I went down, she started to cover up. I says, look, lady, save your energy. I'm not going to take a picture. All I want to do is talk with you. She says, no, I know what you want. You want to take my picture. Why should I let you? So my friends, relatives, and mother can see it on the front pages of the newspapers. I said, now, wait a minute, lady. Don't be so hasty. You have your choice. Do you want your picture to appear in the papers, a rose gallery picture with your number underneath it? Or would you let me make a nice home portrait study of you, using nice soft lighting like Rembrandt would have done? Talking and arguing with her, I convinced her that that was the only logical thing for her to do, to pose for a picture. Now, that was a good catch, you might say, for me, besides the New York cops. Anyway, this showed that by arguing with people, you can get them to uncover. People are reasonable, even jewel thieves.
Well, you know, so many of your images, though, are scenes of street life, particularly at night, things that happen every day. Yet somehow these images still seem larger than life, almost archetypal. Do you take a lot of pictures and then choose the best one, or do you look for the special moment, that precise moment?
I will walk many times with friends down the street, and they'll say, hey, Weegee, here's a drunk or two drunks laying on the gutter. I take one quick look at them. I say, they lack character. So even a drunk must be a masterpiece. I will ride around all night or all year looking for a good drunk picture. One of the most beautiful ones I got, after riding around 2 years, then I made my drunk picture, was a guy in Amsterdam Avenue. One Sunday morning, about 5 o'clock, he was sleeping underneath a canopy of a funeral undertaking parlor. Now that to me was a picture. Of course, the obvious title would be Dead Drunk. So, in other words, I am a perfectionist. When I take a picture, if it's a murder or if it's a drunk, it's got to be good.
Photographer to treat a crime scene like an artist's canvas. Do you have any insights on shooting a murder scene and how it's different than other dramatic scenes?
Now, the easiest kind of a job to cover was a murder, because the stiff would be laying on the ground. He couldn't get up and walk away or get temperamental, and he would be good for at least 2 hours. So I had plenty of time. At fires, you had to work very fast.
Okay, so what about if you're at a scene and that fateful moment has passed? How do you decide what to shoot to make it something better than just the typical news photo? I went back to that picture I showed of the entire tenement building.
One of the best pictures I've made is, just to give you a little aside, I got up 9 o'clock one night and I said to myself, I'm going to take a nice little ride and work up an appetite. I arrive right in the heart of Little Italy, 10 Prince Street. Here's a guy had been bumped off in the doorway of a little candy store. This was a nice, balmy, hot summer's night. The detectives are all over, but all the 5 stories of the tenement, people are on the fire escape. They're looking, they're having a good time. Some of the kids are even reading the funny papers and the comics. There was another photographer there, and he made what we call a 10-foot shot. He made a shot of just a guy laying in the doorway. That was it. To me, this was drama. This was like a backdrop. I stepped all the way back about 100 feet. I used flash powder, and I got this whole scene. The people on the fire escapes, the body, everything. Of course, the title for it was Balcony Seats at a Murder. That picture won me a gold medal with a real genuine diamond. So that was it. In other words, I tried to humanize the news story. Of course, I ran into snags with the dopey editors. If it was a fire, they'd say, where's the burning building? I says, look, they all look alike. I says, look, Here's the people affected by the burning building.
So obviously, you have to have a special sense of when the moment is exactly right.
He's truly a great photographer. And we started talking about things, and he said something happens. It's 1,000th part of a fleeting second. It's up to the photographer to capture that on film, because like a dying day, the things will never come back again.
He was referring there to Alfred Stieglitz, who was his predecessor as the great documenter of New York. And it's really fascinating to compare the two of them, because Stieglitz was a walker, and he would walk all around New York, and he would take amazing photographs in the early part of the last century. But comparing his work, this is something I recommend you do if you're really into this, comparing his work with Weegee's and the difference that came with the automobile and the fact that Weegee was on wheels, and just other technical innovations that Weegee had, but also how they personally interacted with the subjects. Stieglitz was much more into making a perfect art photograph, whereas Weegee was much more into having an emotional connection with the subject. And if it's fleeting, that means you've got to be very, very quick on the draw.
News photography teaches you to think fast, to be sure of yourself, self-confidence. When you go out on a story, you don't go back for another sitting. You got to get it.
Is there anything else that you imagined doing? Anything else that could have been more satisfying?
News photography. This is the most wonderful experience for any man or woman to go through. It's like a modern Aladdin's lamp. You rub it, in this case the camera, you push the button, and it gives you the things you want.
It gives you the things you want. Well, thank you. I'm very glad we actually got Weegee himself into the event tonight. And you know, just as a quick little aside, those of you who come to the Noir City Festival know that I do a lot of work with film preservation and things, and I want to give thanks to the people who had the foresight to actually make that recording of him in 1958. That's like very, very little exists of him actually talking about his work, and it really it goes to show how you can't take any of this stuff for granted. And the fact that they did that, they put it out on a vinyl record in 1958, Weegee and 7 other photographers talking about their work, and now thanks to the internet, it took me about a minute and a half to make him show up here tonight. So I think that's absolutely fantastic, and I want to acknowledge those nameless people who had the sense to make that recording of him when they did. Okay, after Weegee had this amazing success with the book Naked City, you can go, Danny, you can give us the screen back. He did an amazing thing. He said that he was done with crime. He wasn't going to shoot crime pictures anymore. And so he turned his camera on really creating what was essentially an autobiographical record of New York as he knew it when he was growing up. Just to give you a quick background, as I mentioned, he came to the United States when he was 11 years old. His family was from Galicia, which is now the Ukraine. His father desperately wanted to be a rabbi and studied. When he came to the United States, he continued his study and eventually became a rabbi. But the relationship with his father was very, very strained because it's very much like a novel. It was the old world father and the new world son, really at loggerheads. And when Weegee got to New York, obviously he arrived as Usher Felig, and his first name was immediately changed to Arthur at Ellis Island. So he was Arthur Fellig for his whole life, except when he ordained himself Weegee. And he left home very early. They were incredibly poor, dirt poor, the family. His father sold household goods on a pushcart on the Lower East Side. And Arthur was out there on the street trying to make a living very, very early on. He hooked up with a guy who took photographs. This, I think, was the crucial incident in his life that sort of set him on this path. He hooked up with a guy who took photographs of kids on ponies. And he said he realized early on that no matter how poor a family was, if you put their kid on a pony, they'd buy that picture. Right? So he said you never took a picture of kids during the week because they never dressed up. They didn't want the picture of their kids in the tattered clothes. You had to keep the pony all week. Go out, take the pictures on the weekend when they put the kids in the good clothes. Then you'd go around house by house and you'd sell the pictures during the following week. I mean, it's amazing, but that's how he did it. Of course, he decided to set out on his own. Even as a teenager, he was a freelance, mentality, and he realized it was impossible because he had to feed the horse. So, kind of a dumb idea when you're trying to make it in this business to not be able to have enough money to feed the horse. But he caught on with these photography agencies, ended up working at the New York Times, and the rest, as they say, is history. But in the mid-'40s, this is a very iconic Weegee photograph. I mean, I don't know how many people have seen this image and not realized that this is a Weegee photograph. And it's also incredible because, like he talked about, catching that moment, like the dying end of the day, this is an extraordinary image because this is, nobody's imagined Photoshop at the point this was taken, and yet this looks like a completely Photoshopped image. It is so incredibly perfect in every way. All the faces of the kids, all the gestures. This little boy here in the middle, I mean, even at that distance, you can say, wait, is that really that kid's head? Or did they stick it on that body? I mean, but somehow he would get these amazing photos. Now, this is, as I was saying about the cropping of images, this is a photograph that's appeared in many forms, always cropped differently. And I think you see this tenderness in Weegee when he trains his camera on kids. Can you see the little kitten in the girl's arms there? As you'll see in a minute when I get into some of his other less ethical techniques, you almost wonder if he gave that girl the cat and said, now go lie down with the other kids, But it really is remarkable. It shows that he had this ability to be Johnny on the spot, not just when it was a crime scene, but this was just kids sleeping on a tenement during a really, really hot summer in New York, sleeping out on the fire escape. Now, this is another one of his most famous photographs. Who knows the name of this photograph? Okay. I wonder if you could guess. This is called Their First Murder. And this was a photograph that he took that is so extraordinary. The woman in the center that you see, the older woman in the center, her son has just been killed. And literally, Weegee is taking this photograph standing over the body. And this kid that you can barely see right over here, the boy right in front of her, is like a cousin of the victim who is trying to push his way through the crowd to see the body. And all of these reactions, this is what I said about there is no single emotion evident in a Weegee photograph. That's what he was after. It's like a party for this kid on the left over here. He's having a great time. And this little girl in the foreground, I mean, that expression is extraordinary. And this girl in the foreground over here is like 50 going on 12. She's seen it all already. This is not her first murder, I don't think. Very, very amazing photograph. And he has that incredible city skyline behind it. Amazing. Another example of kind of the same thing. I don't think this is the best way to see it. This resolution isn't so great on the screen. But every face in this crowd tells a story. And this is really what he was doing in Naked City in the book, and in the book he was about to put out, which was just about New Yorkers. You know, these are, well, as you'll see when I get to it. Now here he would go out to Coney Island every summer and photograph the exodus from the city out to the beaches. And this is emblematic of his style. It's like, wow, that's a great photo. And he would say, I had to wait like 3 hours for somebody to lose a kid. He would sit there like, why doesn't, and you know, he was really, really sorely tempted to like grab somebody's kid and like rough him up and say, go to the lifeguard, you know, because I got to get that damn picture. And you could just see that, but it's all perfect, the slightly tilted angle and the sign, and the guy looks great. The kid is squalling just perfectly. In the early 40s, this was during the war, Weegee started experimenting as if the night was not enough for him to go out with his flash in the night. He started experimenting with infrared film. And he would go into the movie theaters in Manhattan and photograph people in the movie theaters in the dark. Right? This is a really remarkable photograph, because a document of its time. This is 1943. The sailor is obviously putting the make on this girl that he's with. Her legs are up on the seat in front of her, and his arm is between her legs. I mean, there is no mistaking what is happening here. There's a guy sitting right behind him just watching the whole thing, and next to him is a black guy sound asleep with his head back. I think he's going to choke. I mean, you can barely see him in this picture. And here's another black guy in the front, just like, I think that dude's taking a picture of me. I mean, it really is pretty amazing. But it speaks to the melting pot that Manhattan was at that time, and it really is a pretty remarkable, that whole series is remarkable. Here's a photo that he took called Two Girls in a Bar. Well, there you go. I mean, Weegee was clearly documenting things that other people were not yet prepared to photograph. And as classic examples of Weegee's people, they are totally unabashed. You will notice that the image of the guy getting out of the paddy wagon, the transvestite, and these two women in the bar, they could care less that they're being photographed by Weegee. They're happy about it, really. More of Weegee's people. Shorty ringing in the local mascot, ringing in 1943 downtown. As you see, Weegee was a specialist in people who have celebrated a little bit too much. And this is kind of, I've always been amused by this photograph, because I wondered if the Coca-Cola sign was some kind of editorial thing on Weegee's part. Like, dude, try the Coke next time. Okay, now if you've ever heard the Pogues song Fairy Tale of New York, these are the people that they're singing about in that song. Remarkable. Just an absolutely remarkable image. I mean, she's got the big shiner, but they're out celebrating. And look at the incredibly graceful way they're both handling their drinks. It's absolutely a gorgeous photograph. Okay, Weegee's most famous and controversial photograph. It has two titles. One is The Fashionable People. The other one that he retitled it is The Critic. We could actually have an entire college course based on this one photograph. This is the 1943 opening of the Metropolitan Opera in New York. Weegee is there on assignment to photograph the swells arriving for the event. This is the photograph that he turns in as his evidence of the event, okay? It gets picked up by Life magazine. These two women, Mrs. Margaret Cavanaugh and Lady Decies, were very, very prominent New Yorkers who were mortified by this photograph, which, of course, was Weegee's intention all along. This is exactly what he loved to do to wealthy people in his photographs. The truth behind this photograph is that this was no accident. He actually knew this woman. She was a regular at Sammy's, which was the Bowery Follies place where Weegee was a regular. He picked her up. He had an assistant named Lou Liotta at this time, and Lou Liotta testified to this later on. They drove around in Weegee's car for about 2 hours and got her totally drunk, which was not hard to do. They got out at the Met. Lou Liotta's job was to hold her upright until these two arrived, at which point, when they got out of the car, he had a sign worked out like, "Let her loose," and she just staggered forward a few steps, and as Lou Liotta said, the flash bulbs went off. He said, "I thought I was going to go blind." And it's fabulous how Mrs. Kavanaugh doesn't look at her. She is just so totally together. It's like, I'm not looking over here. I'm not seeing this. The flash is going off. I'm posing for the picture. Now, whether this is apocryphal or not, I don't know, but there's a story that like 6 months later, her son, Mrs. Kavanaugh's son, is in the trenches in Europe. This is right during World War II. And this photograph rains out of the sky, dropped by the Nazis en masse as propaganda saying, "This is what you're fighting for." And he sees this photograph of his mother, right? It's like, oh my God. Now, that's his story, and he's sticking to it. That sounds pretty amazing to me. But this is probably Weegee's most famous photograph. And there is the man himself at the height of his glory. Okay, now I'm going to have to be kind of quick now if we're going to have any time for questions or anything. But I do want to show you, this was the second book that he came out with that was not crime pictures. But I do want to show you very quickly something very important. What happened, and we're going to go with this in just a second, what happened with the success of Naked City is that someone very similar to Weegee, a writer named Mark Hellinger, he was a New York columnist, very Damon Runyon-esque kind of character, had come to Hollywood in the late 1930s from New York and become a very successful movie producer. He bought the rights to the title Naked City from the publishers of Weegee's book and created a film called The Naked City that is totally inspired by Weegee's work. But he put a police manhunt plot to it. So what Hellinger wanted to do, because Weegee's stuff was so influential, he wanted to figure out a way to make a dramatic narrative that felt the same way as Weegee's photographs, with all these little vignettes of the city. It's a very clever way to introduce the characters of the cops and the killers in the story, mixing them into, these are just 3 more stories of the 8 million in the Naked City. But it's kind of fascinating that all of that was done because it's almost like those scenes are like turning the pages in one of Weegee's books. You're just seeing these little vignettes of life in the city. What was fascinating about what happened after that was, sadly, it was like so many stories, Weegee got pulled to Hollywood, and it kind of wrecked him. You can give me the screen back. He didn't like it. He went out to Hollywood. He figured, oh, they want to make me a big deal now. And he kind of got lost out there. He actually started acting in films as a bit player and serving as a technical consultant to other films. He really had nothing whatsoever to do with the production of Naked City. But when he was out in Hollywood, he really didn't respond to the place at all. He had very caustic things to say about it. He didn't like the people. He thought they were all fake compared to his people in New York. I included this photograph because, to me, this is Weegee meets Hollywood. This is a picture of one of the most powerful people in Hollywood, Hedda Hopper, the gossip columnist, and this is Weegee's photograph of her called Hopper's Topper. And what I especially like is he got the lipstick on her teeth right there in the front. I think that's just, yes, that is perfect. While he was out there, of course, he's in the glamour capital of the world, and what does he do? He goes to like the Follies, and he ends up taking a whole series of photographs of strippers. that became the basis of his book, Weegee's Hollywood. And as you can see, this is a guy who goes to Hollywood, and it really doesn't look any different than where he was in New York. And his images of strippers at work look kind of like crime scenes in a way. But here's like an example of Weegee at his best. Anybody would make a beautiful fine art photograph of this woman. She's got a beautiful figure. She's all painted in gold. She's like a stripper down on Hollywood Boulevard or something. But that's not the photograph. The photograph is, she's having a drink of water, and this guy comes in and just makes the whole image with not realizing he's about to have his photograph taken. You may not know that this iconic image is photographed by Weegee. He was hired to be just a set photographer when Billy Wilder shot The 7-Year Itch, and there is no question that Wilder's writing of this scene for Marilyn Monroe was inspired by looking at photographs in Naked City of girls having their skirts blown by the subway. And this is one of those weird, twisted cultural moments where they take the original or the original image, put a movie star in it, and then the guy who photographed the original image photographs the movie star on the set. But here's what was fascinating. While he was in Hollywood, Weegee became obsessed with leaving behind all of his previous work and trying new techniques that involved lens distortion. This is one of a series of photographs he took of Marilyn Monroe with this new technique. Now, only Weegee would photograph Marilyn Monroe and make her look like that. And it must be said that she was very, very fond of him and was really, really excited and pleased by this series of photographs. I'm not going to show you the whole series, but there's like 5 of them. And the taking of these pictures of Marilyn, to me, is a very, very significant, we now know in hindsight, very significant cultural event, as you'll see. At this time, clearly, the man had a sense of humor about himself and didn't really care what people thought. This is not exactly a self-portrait, but yeah. And this is a picture of him going through his photographs. He lived in that same studio apartment up until from 1936 until 1947, moved back to Hollywood, and then when he went back to New York, he lived in a slightly bigger apartment, but no more orderly. And this is how he cataloged photographs, I guess. And by 1960 or so, this is the kind of work that he was doing. He had succumbed to the notion of creating art photography and doing multiple exposures and things. And, I'm not critical of this picture or anything, but it just seems so ludicrous compared to the work that he was doing before. He had kind of lost his way. He didn't want to shoot the stuff that he was famous for any longer. What ended up happening was he inspired people, including this man, film director Stanley Kubrick, who obviously started out as a photographer in New York himself and worked for Look magazine in the early days. If you've seen Kubrick's early films like Killer's Kiss and The Killing, Killer's Kiss especially is directly influenced by Weegee's crime photography. It's his attempt to do what Mark Hellinger did, only do it photographically, not just adopt the attitude of Naked City, but actually capture the Weegee look on film. He ended up hiring Weegee as a consultant on Dr. Strangelove, as a photographic consultant on Dr. Strangelove, and Weegee was the still photographer for that movie and is actually in the film. In the famous pie fight scene in the war room, Weegee is actually there documenting the whole thing and takes a few pies in the face for his trouble. This is why I pointed out the Marilyn pictures. The artist as celebrity. Do you think other young people in New York were noticing? Yeah, I definitely think that this guy from Pittsburgh was into Weegee in a big way, and definitely those Marilyn pictures and Weegee's work with distortion and his odd, strange celebrity with being a faux artist and playing with people's expectations was something that really influenced Andy Warhol, and this was Weegee's photograph, his photographic portrait of Andy Warhol, one of the last things that he did. This was Weegee's obituary in the New York papers, and there you have it. It's all about what they say in the head when you die. And he is a crime photographer. That is how he was known in New York when he died. There are all kinds of mistakes in this obituary that I'm sure he would not be too fond of. But really kind of an amazing life story, and the guy's influence remains huge. I actually think there's been kind of a renaissance in the past few years, with his work from the 30s and 40s. And something I just want to leave you with is, I don't know if there are any really young people in the crowd tonight, but I hope a lot of what I've said about his style and the way he went about his work is worth thinking about now because of us living in the digital age and how incredibly easy all this photography is, and that there really are no news photographers any longer. We are the news photographers. When was the last time you saw a really extraordinary photograph in the newspaper? It just really doesn't happen anymore. Everything is video now, and while that's interesting in its own right for the power that gives the public, it has removed the artistry from capturing that exact moment. And if for nothing else, I idolize this guy because of his ability to capture that moment with a speed graphic camera. If you ever held one of those, they are so cumbersome, it's impossible to believe. He was doing it with flash bulbs that he had to exchange with every picture. It was a crank mechanism. There was nothing automatic about it, and he did it all without ever taking the cigar out of his mouth. Absolutely phenomenal.